So I've said a few things about women. Oh, and maybe would you mind also turning off the front lights? The top two, I think they are. Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind of you. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that's about right. Okay, so yes, I've mentioned women in passing, and obviously we have seen some very important and influential women, but they've mostly been like queens or that kind of social position. So the other thing that I've said about women, I think, is that things actually got worse for women in the 16th and 17th centuries compared to the way things have been for many women, not for all of them, during the Middle Ages. Things actually took a step backwards in certain ways, partly because of the Reformation and the fact that the Bible was written 2,000 years ago when women were, again, in a lower social position. And because of the importance given to the Bible during the Reformation, that reflected itself in a lower status for women at that time. So let's take a look at some of the details of what was going on in this period. Yeah, women in the limelight. We've seen, as I say, a few, but not very many, because history is a reflection of the patriarchal society, patriarchal meaning man-dominated society. We tend to see it through the lives and actions of men. And I've mentioned women in, well, three main contexts. The first one, as I said, was royalty. Women in high positions, obviously having a big influence. And it was somewhat surprising to early modern England that women could do that England could have queens. As you remember, Henry VIII's obsession was to have a son, never dreaming that the son would die and that it would be his two daughters that went on to reign. So we've got the wives of Henry VIII, especially Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, who were highly educated and influential people. Catherine on the Catholic side, I think we talked about how cleverly she kept herself stable during that very difficult time of her separation from Henry, where she sold her possessions, she sold her jewelry, and she became she actually became the first ambassador as well to her in her early life, the first woman ambassador, I think, in the whole of Europe. Yeah, so we've got these royal women. We've got women also in the daughters of Henry, so around Henry's family generally, a lot of very powerful women growing up, and that's an important feature of that time. So Mary and Elizabeth. So yeah, we've got women in that kind of very high status situation. We've got Mary Stuart as well, of course, the Mary Queen of Scots, again a relative of Henry VIII through his sister who married the Scottish king. And Lady Jane Grey, the Night Queen. So that's one area in which we can see women having an obvious influence. Religious martyrs, again, I think I've mentioned a little bit. And the bravery with which some women met their fate as they were taken to be burned to death. As I said in the lecture on suffering, was used as a kind of political weapon or a discursive weapon for telling the society in general, which was mostly, of course, male-dominated, hey, if a woman can suffer like that, what's wrong with you? What are you complaining about? So it became a kind of rhetorical tool for forcing people to feel that they should be lucky and not to complain about the conditions of their life. And that would be, well, in particular, Anne Askew, who actually died under Henry VIII for her Protestant beliefs, and the fact that she was a high-class woman had a big effect on the importance that was given to her. But others, like Alice Driver, who died under Mary, these women came to have a very powerful symbolic influence through the later part of the 16th and the 17th centuries. And I think I showed you that ghastly picture of Anne Askew and her torture, and we looked at the way that women were being burned and the bravery with which they met their death. Okay, so that's the second side in which women have been mentioned, the second kind of context in which women have been mentioned in these lectures so far. And the other context that I've touched upon is witches. You remember that witches were mostly women, and hundreds of them were put to death during the period that we're talking about. So what else is there to say? Plenty. There's actually a lot more to say, surprisingly. Let's start off with literature. Well, actually, yeah, I guess that's really a fourth context, because I have mentioned that a little bit. We've said that Mary Sidney Herbert was compared with Shakespeare during her day, and the first woman to make her reputation as a writer of secular works. The fact that women were not just writing, they had written previously, but they had been writing religious material usually. Even their diaries and things that we've got are very often focused on their religious beliefs and so on. So she was the first woman to write in a secular, non-religious way. Things like the Tragedy of Antony, okay? Which she translated in this case. She didn't write it herself, but she made a name for herself as a writer and a translator. We've got women writers from the medieval period, but as I say, they nearly all wrote religious literature. Julian of Norwich and Margery Kempe would be the most famous, and it's perhaps worth just jumping back a little bit in time here to look at them. So let me do that. Margery Kempe was writing in the late medieval period, and so was Julian of Norwich. In fact, they slightly overlap. Well, they do overlap, and they would doubtless have known about each other. And on the other hand, they had rather different lives. So we can see the typical educated woman of that time would be someone more like Julian of Norwich. And she's the first woman known to have written a book in English. And Margery Kempe is actually the first, not just woman, but the first person to write an autobiography, a published autobiography. So She actually initiated an entire genre of literature. You'll remember that I said that education for women frequently took place in the convents. Julian of Norwich is an example of that. Once the convents, along with the monasteries, were closed, the monasteries had an educational function which got largely replaced by schools that started to open up for boys. But this is another problem with the early modern period, that very few schools opened up for girls. So the convents closed, and that was the main access that they'd had to education, and then that was cut off after Henry VIII closed them down. So people like Julian of Norwich would have got their education from the nuns in the convents. And then after the Reformation, you got these secular schools that were beginning to take on the role of the convents and of the monasteries, but they were nearly all for boys. So this is another reason why women's status tended to go down in that early modern period. And it became harder for girls to get an education during that Tudor period. Margery Kempe was a religious mystic, but she was also a family woman. She, unlike Julian of Norwich, she didn't join a convent and live her life in that way. She actually was a married woman with a family, at least 14 children. We don't know exactly, but at least 14 children. She was a businesswoman. She started a couple of companies. She was a traveler. She went to various parts of Europe. She went to Jerusalem. A kind of pilgrimage to the Holy Land was a kind of important part of medieval people's life if they could do it, and she did. She was one of the probably not all that many women who undertook that difficult and dangerous journey in those days. And on top of it, she probably couldn't read or write. So you're thinking, how did she become the author of a book? Well, it was probably written down by a scribe as she spoke it. We can't be sure about that, but that's what scholars think, that she dictated it to a scribe. You can see she was a successful woman. She would be able to employ a scribe, no problem, and it's considered that that's probably what she did. Now let's move on to the Tudor and Stuart period. Although most kind of commercial concerns, most businesses were conducted by men, were run by men, you have home-based businesses, those kinds of things that can be done kind of within the family structure of the home. Businesses run by women of that kind were not so unusual. So what kinds of businesses would they be? Well, in the case of Margery Kempe, going back to, again, the late Middle Ages, well, she ran a brewery. You didn't need all that much to run a brewery. You just needed somewhere that you could have large barrels to hold it would usually be beer, to hold the beer. Beer needs to have a certain temperature, so you'd have to have somewhere that you could keep warm for a period of time, so that it would the chemical reaction would take place that would make it alcoholic. And she ran a grain mill. Again, people would come to her, what presumably must have been a fairly large house with plenty of space in it, where they had two big grindstones which would go round and round making the grain into flour. It's a very simple piece of machinery, but most people would not have that, and therefore they bring their corn to a mill for it to be ground down into flour. These are both quite popular businesses for women in the late medieval period, and that kind of thing carried on into early modern times. So you'd find women doing that kind of business in the 16th century as much as they had been in the 15th or 14th, and again into the 17th century and so on. It was the kind of work that a woman could get involved with. Especially many of these things, it would very often be the husband who'd started the business, and then he'd die, and the woman would carry on. So this is something that happens in a number of professions. Textiles, dressmaking businesses, traditionally a woman's concern. And printing presses, and that's where I've mentioned the death of the husband. Very often you'll see in the imprimatur of the book on the colophon page where they're putting the information about the printing of the book, it'll say printed at the press of the widow of, and then the man who started it, and it would be the widow who would carry on the business after her husband died. So there are actually quite a number of printing presses that were being run by women after their husband had died. Okay, you can see why that would happen. Everybody's got contracts, everybody's waiting for their books to come out, but all the print has been set up on the pages, and boom, suddenly the husband drops dead. Oh, people, we still want our book published. We're very sorry, and everything. We still want our book published. We still got our contracts. So that you can see how there would be a kind of pressure even on the wife to continue with that kind of business. But it was unusual for women to actually gain an apprenticeship. The idea of an apprenticeship is something that I should explain a little bit. These days, people, they do what you're doing. They go to university, and then they get a job. And very often, when they get the job, they spend the first few months of the job saying, well, whatever you did in university, we need you to do something different now. So your first few months will be training you to do the job, how to do the job. Well, that's not how things worked in medieval times. Only the real elite, the kind of academic and wealthy elite, was able to go to university. Most people would get an apprenticeship. This would mean that they would be trained by a master craftsman, a master in that industry, in that kind of area of work. They would be trained, and the usual thing would be that they would pay to be trained. Okay, so they'd be working for nothing, basically. And then once they'd qualified, then they would start earning money, and it would be a matter usually of about, 3 years, I think, but sometimes more than 3 years, depending on the trade. And you think of the kinds of things they had to do. Blacksmiths would have to make shoes for horses by heating up the metal and banging on it until it was in the right shape to put on the foot of a horse. Bakers would have to learn how to make bread. That wasn't going to get them into trouble with the people, because if people weren't happy with their bread, there were some rather nasty punishments for people who didn't make sufficiently good quality bread and things like this. So everything, there was a kind of training program, and it would nearly always be men on those programs. I'm looking here, jumping forwards now to the end of the 17th century, and we find that at this stage, out of 100 or more than 100 new apprentices to the clothing trade, which is one of those trades that women would have a chance to work in, out of over 100 applicants, over 100 new apprentices, only 6 were women. And we've got the documentation still for one of those women, whose name was Mary Harrison. This is just an example of the expectation and the normal situation at this time. There would be a legal document called an indenture. The legal document was a kind of contract between the person running the company, the boss, and the apprentice, the person who was coming in to be trained. So this is the document for this particular young woman. You'll notice that it's signed by another woman. It was actually a company that was run by a woman. Okay? So women could run companies at this stage, and all through this period it could happen, but it was quite unusual. How unusual? Let's find out. The form, the indenture form, assumes that the apprentices are men. So if you take a look at that, here's a part of the contract up in the top there. I've made it a little bit bigger so you can see it. It says, he shall nanika, and they've had to put in by hand, they've had to change it by hand because it's actually she. Okay? It's been changed manually, but the printed form is made for men. It's a man's world. Okay? And we can see that that's been done several times. Okay? It says master, and that's been changed to mastress, an attempt to say mistress. It's been changed by hand. And himself has been changed to herself, rather clumsy, but attempting to make the contract applicable to a woman. But the basic assumption is that it's going to be a man. So that's I think, a fairly clear example of how the social expectation was that it would be a man. It's like that kind of, I don't know if you've heard that little conundrum that I sometimes have a lot of fun with my students with, but a young man is in a car accident with his father. The father dies, you know this one, do you? The father dies, and the young man is taken to hospital. The surgeon in the hospital looks at the young man and says, "Oh my God, this young man needs an operation. But I can't operate on him because he's my son." In the context, you probably understand what's going on here. The surgeon is a woman. But I've had students, if I don't give them this kind of context so that they know what I'm talking about, they can sit there for 10 minutes trying to imagine, he wasn't the real father, he was married to another woman, and blah, 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 all kinds of possibilities before they hit on the idea that the surgeon could actually be a woman. We still have that kind of stereotyped idea about certain professions, that they are dominated by men. Okay? So saying that it happened back then in the 17th century is not necessarily something for us to laugh about. Ha ha ha, look at what they were like then, because we still have that. Okay? Not as clearly as they did then, and things are obviously changing, but there'd still tend to be an assumption that the surgeon would be a man. The education of women. Now, we've said that women had a disadvantage when the convents were closed, but there were men who were promoting women's education. And they were pretty famous. Thomas More, Juan Luis Vives, who was brought over by Catherine of Aragon to teach her daughter Mary, and Roger Ascham. These people are famous. They wrote books about education. They wrote books about the education of women. Juan Luis Vives wrote the first books specifically on the education of women, all about educating women, and boasts in the frontispiece, in the introduction to the book, this is the first time anybody has done this. And as far as I can see, he's pretty much right. Nobody had ever thought about writing a book on the education of women until this time. And it's true, we're talking about three men here. Okay, which is sort of slightly ironic in itself, but they are men who were promoting women's education back in the 16th century. And the other point to note is that they were within a fairly narrow socioeconomic belt. They were really concerned with the elite, the social elite. So this is not something that filtered through to the average 16th century woman. This is something that would have made a difference to the kind of education, not just that Mary received, Mary Tudor, or Elizabeth, or people like this, the kings, the queens of that, princesses of that period, but that kind of social class of lords and ladies, well, those ladies would have received an education, sure, mostly. Okay, there were exceptions, and we're going to move on and we're going to look and see how even the kings and queens could sometimes, or the kings could be against the education of women, even in the case of their own children. We're going to see that. But the upper class elite had a much better chance of being able to get an education than, obviously, the ordinary person. And there was some fairly advanced thinking going on. And one of the few people who wrote about and championed the cause of lower class women was Richard Mulcaster. He was way ahead of his time. He believed that everybody should get an elementary education, something which did not happen until the later part of the 19th century. He was hundreds of years ahead of his time. Okay, Gimukyoiku, compulsory education did not come into England until the later part of the 19th century. So here's this guy writing about it in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. He's pretty radical, and he did not get much acceptance for his ideas. Most women got little or no education. And then you get the development of Puritanism. Puritanism was generally bad news for women. The Puritans became more and more of an issue as the 16th century continued. And of course, as we saw in our history of the 17th century, the Puritans actually take control of the country under Oliver Cromwell, and they're running the show. And these people are not positive about women and the position of women in society. By the start of the 17th century, the Puritan thinking has influenced the society to the extent that women are seen mostly as helpmates to their husbands and nurturers of their children. They are not supposed, by the typical thinking of those days, they're not supposed to do anything else. Could we perhaps close that door at the back there? Thanks. And then, as I say, even sometimes the royalty were not positive about women's education. King James coming down from Scotland in the early 17th century did not help the situation by his chauvinistic, narrow-minded ideas about women. You'll remember, we talked about his sexuality and said that he was probably gay. And of course, gay people are not necessarily prejudiced against women, but I think in this case, he stood up for the witch hunts, which mostly were against women, and he was against the education of women pretty strongly. So he seems to have had, some kind of negative feeling towards women. And his own daughter did not apparently get a classical education. Typical education in those days, Latin continued to be the international language of Europe. And so if you were an educated person, you would have to learn Latin so that you could read books on medicine, theology, or any topic that were published in any part of Europe. There would very often be two versions of it, but an English version in England and a Latin version for kind of dispersal throughout Europe, or an Italian and Latin version, or whatever it might be. But Latin was the universal language. And so a classical education, Latin, and also Greek. I mean, Greek was still quite an important language in those days. He apparently rejected the idea that his own daughter, should get that kind of education. He said, "To make women learned and foxes tame has the same effect, to make them more cunning." Okay, there'll be zurui. If you teach a woman, if you give her education, and if you teach foxes to be tame, all that happens is they just become slyer, more zurui than they already are. Keep them ignorant as far as women are concerned, and foxes, don't try to bring them into your house and house train them, okay? Keep them in their place, all right? So that's coming from the king. And you can see that that kind of thinking is not going to help the position of women at this time. And, yeah, most women, if they got, I've said that they might have a basic ability to read, but among the lower classes, men and women mostly were unable to read. There was still the professional job of a scribe to write things down for people who couldn't read or write when they had to have a legal document or something like that. That was still a job for people who could read and write, to write out documents and so on for people who couldn't themselves read and write. And yeah, basically women were trained up to be housewives, and that was it. At the same time, there were beginning to be private boarding schools for girls. These start cropping up. We find them in the records, mostly from the early 17th century onwards. Hackney became a sort of centre for the education of girls from well-to-do families, and there were several schools set up for rich girls. Catherine Phillips was a poet and a translator in the first half of the 17th century. She went to a Presbyterian school run by a Mrs. Salmon from the age of 8. Most schools would be, or many schools would be like that. They would have a religious basis. So this school followed the Presbyterian church, which was more popular, if you remember, in Scotland the Church of England being a weaker form of Protestantism. So it's a more strongly Protestant church. And yet, there was a school for women within it. And there's another school run by Mrs. Perrich. She had over 100 students, and there were several other smaller schools in Hackney, including a few in other parts, and also a few in other parts of the country. So Hackney in London, or in what is now London, so it would have been a separate little town in those days, but it's now part of London. That became the sort of centre for women's education during the first half of the 17th century. But the basic thing about these is that, again, they're not really giving an education. They are training young women in etiquette and basically how to get yourself a rich husband. Okay, they're not really giving education in the sense that we would think of it today. It wasn't until the first half of the 19th century, 200 years later, that you get the first schools that are giving women an education that is comparable to that which a man would get. So it's not until the 19th century that that even begins to happen at school level, and at university level it takes even longer. So the kinds of things would be French. French was always the language of the elite, and again, even today, if you go to a high class, for example, if you want to eat in a more high class kind of place, it'll be a restaurant, okay, a restaurant, which comes from French. There'll be a menu, okay, a menu, and the menu itself will very often be written in French. Okay, they have les petits pois, okay, which for Saxon people are peas. Okay, they'll have les frites, okay, which for Saxon people are chips. Okay, so we've still got that going on, a little bit of sort of snobism about French. And of course that goes right back to the Norman Conquest, when the high class was French-speaking, and we've still got it today. But certainly an educated woman, a high-class woman from those days, she would be able to speak French. She would be able to play musical instruments. So they didn't have the piano that we have. You remember I showed you the early modern instruments. They'd have something called the virginals or harpsichord, sort of precursors to the piano. She would be able to play it. That would be part of her training. Okay, remember, they didn't have television or mobile phones or computers or anything like that for a kind of entertainment. Women in that kind of level of society would be expected to play the piano, well, the harpsichord or the virginals, for hours on end to entertain guests when their husband was having a party. They would take turns at singing and entertaining their guests in that kind of way. That was part of what they were expected to be able to do. Needlework was something that had been, again, since the Middle Ages. Women had sat quietly in a corner, listening while, or maybe not even supposed to listen while the men talked about important things, and they'd be embroidering things, they'd be making. It was all done by hand until the Industrial Revolution came along and mechanized a lot of those tasks in the late 18th century. So they'd be sitting there making these beautiful embroideries and tapestries, which might take years. Some of them, okay? If it's a bigger piece, a more complicated piece, it might take years, okay? So they'd be trained in those kinds of accomplishments, rather than being given an education in the sense that we might understand it today. There were a few charity schools also for girls. The oldest surviving girls' school in England was actually originally a charity school, and it's set up by some local initiative. Somebody wants to help poor women. In this case, John Whitson, the mayor of Bristol, and when he dies, he thinks, well, I've got some money here. Let's give it to setting up a school for poor women children. He might have had some personal reason for especially wanting to choose that it should be for women. Okay, so those kinds of schools were set up, and of course they continued, but it was all local initiative. Just by chance there was somebody in Bristol who wanted to do that for 40 poor women, but another town 10 miles away there was nobody, okay, and there'd be nothing. So it was random. It was not set up by the government at the national level. As I say, you didn't start to get a national system of education until the 19th century. It all depends on, in your particular town, there's somebody who's doing something, and in another town there might be nothing or very little. It would be hit or miss, really. A little bit more kind of generally spread across the society, right up until the 19th century, was something called the dame school. You usually have a single woman who perhaps had never married. She'd somehow got herself an education of some sort. Usually would mean she was basically able to read and write and do fairly simple mathematical or arithmetical operations. And she would take in the local kids, usually boys or girls, and give them some kind of basic education. Those were quite typical all through this period. They were growing and developing. Charles Dickens writes about them, some of them as being, quite good. It would all depend on who the dame was, really. Was she an eccentric old lady who thought that the best thing to do was to hit the children when they got noisy and just kept them quiet? Or was she somebody who really tried to help them to learn things? You get both of that kind described, even in the 19th century by Charles Dickens. So that kind of basic education was beginning to grow up for both boys and girls, whose parents would pay a penny or a few pennies a week to send their children, usually just for a couple of hours a day or something like that. They wouldn't be there all day. They'd go for a short period of time. There's no national policy, as I say. It would depend on the area. It would depend on the person who was doing it. No standards, no control. Somebody opens a dame school. Maybe they're good and they know what they're doing. Maybe they're not. And they don't know what they're doing. It doesn't matter. If people like it, they'll pay for it. And the really elite families basically didn't go to school at all. This would apply to boys as well as girls in the early modern period. Boys and girls tended not to go to school. They tended to be educated at home. Going abroad to study was kind of special privilege for the elite. And although both boys and girls would be educated at home, typically in this period, there was a sort of expectation that the girls wouldn't try too hard, wouldn't want to learn too much, and that they'd drop out at a certain stage, whereas the boys would carry on as long as they were learning things, as long as they wanted, really. So there was a sort of prejudice that too much education was just not a good thing for women. I think I might have made a bit of a mistake here by repeating some of the information on the previous slides. So bear with me if I just say, I think I've got a feeling there might be one or two mistakes in this presentation. But yeah, we have, from the middle of the 17th century, we're starting to see women who are saying that kind of school that just gives an education for girls so they can get married to a rich husband is not adequate. And they're starting to try to push for something more. Although, as I say, it isn't until the 19th century that you really get schools that are giving an equivalent education to girls on the same kind of level as boys. But there are people who are moving in that direction already here in the 17th century. Again, we've got two women who were able to get an excellent education. Woolley, her family were doctors, skilled in medicine, and she just sat in on all the boys' lessons. She wasn't going to be told, you're a girl, you shouldn't be here. So she insisted, and she sat there, and she got everything that the boys got. There was no way, however, that a woman was going to be allowed to be a doctor. Okay, I mean, if you told that story about the car accident, well, not that they had cars, but you know what I mean, in the 17th century, and you said, well, the surgeon was a woman, they'd say, what are you talking about? Okay, that's impossible. All right, so they could learn about the subject, but they would never really be able to practice it in the same way as a man. And this continues to be a problem all through the 18th and 19th centuries, that you can learn about it, but we're not going to let you do it. Okay? The first woman doctor that we saw in England was accepted by mistake in the middle of the 19th century. She was a very, a very masculine-looking woman, and they actually thought she was a man. When they found out their mistake, it was a good few years before they actually said, well, they let her do the job, but it was a good few years before they allowed another woman. Okay? Basically, they let her through by mistake. So we've got Woolley, we've got Machin. Again, she had learned, again, through home tutoring, to speak many languages, and she had been a tutor to the daughter of Charles I. So she was a high-class lady herself, and she set up a school in Tottenham, another part of what is now London, in the later 17th century. So we get people like this. Women, notice that we've got women taking the initiative to teach women. And some of those schools were just, teaching etiquette and how to get a good husband, but there are starting to be some schools that are seriously trying to teach women and give them something more like a proper education. Machin, for example, included grammar, rhetoric, logic, languages, mathematics, geography, history, music, painting, and poetry, which is getting pretty good and getting pretty close to the kind of education that a man might expect to receive. It's covering a lot of the same ground, but I don't know how long this school lasted. I can't remember offhand how long it lasted, but it's not like those schools from the 19th century that began and were giving a very high-level education to women and are still there today, like Cheltenham Ladies College or places like that. I don't know how long it lasted. These schools were, in a sense, more like experimental in nature. So we are slowly but surely getting a number of schools that are offering girls an education that's not just grooming them to be the wives of elite gentlemen. However, as I say, they're not allowed, even if they get an education, they're not allowed to become doctors, they're not allowed to become lawyers, they're not allowed to join the church, they're not allowed to attend university. And these kinds of restrictions, well, the church is still, I mean, the Church of England is still divided over the issue of women priests. It doesn't want to go there. And the Catholic Church is even stricter on that front. But most of the other restrictions did get lifted towards the later part of the 19th century, and you start to get women who are allowed to go to university. Although even then they would go to university, but they wouldn't be allowed to get a degree. They wouldn't be allowed to graduate. You can come to the courses, but you can't graduate. Okay? And in some cases, up until the middle of the 20th century, Cambridge being one of the latest, actually. I was shocked. Oxford, I think at least 20 years previously to Cambridge, actually Oxford allowed women to take a degree and to graduate. Cambridge had colleges for women, Newnham and Girton, but the women were for many years not allowed to actually graduate. Okay, so even if they got an education, the society would still not let them in to many of the professions. Right. Focusing on the middle of the 17th century, we start to get some very interesting behavior or patterns that are starting to develop among women. We've got some earlier examples, but I think the Civil War was a big agent for change in the way of people's thinking. It's not just that the king had his head chopped off, it's that all sorts of things are being reevaluated and looked at and thought about differently. And that's why perhaps it's not surprising, although I think it is remarkable, that women did emerge at this time as a political force. And again, it's most of what I'm telling you today is stuff that I never got any hint of when I was at university or when I learned about all of this stuff. You have to dig. Even today, you have to dig to find these things. So here we go. In 1642, we've got what were described at the time as great multitudes of women. That implies hundreds at least, maybe even thousands of women marching on Parliament and saying that where there is one woman now here, there will be 500 tomorrow. And it is as good for them to die here as at home. So they are angry with the Civil War. They don't want it to continue. They're worried that it's harming the economy and that they can't feed their families while this war is going on. They're saying, hey, you guys, you've got to sort this out. You've got to stop fighting. Okay? It didn't work, but they did it. They did it. All right? They stood up and they protested publicly. They went through the streets. They marched on Parliament. The protesters were mainly the wives and widows of traders who were worried that Parliament's opposition to the king would lead to a loss of trade with other European countries. So basically, war, as far as they were concerned, is not good for business. And that was the underlying motivation. And then the following year, you've got more than 5,000, we have numbers here, more than 5,000 women marching on Parliament demanding that the Civil War be ended. Okay, the movement has grown. They were right when they said that, if there's one of us today, there'll be 5 of us tomorrow. The movement was growing. And women were standing up and pushing the politicians, who of course were all men. They were pushing the politicians and saying, look, we have demands here. We have issues, then we want you to listen and pay attention to what we're saying. This is pretty new and pretty surprising, that you get women standing up and protesting in that kind of way. And, okay, yeah, they weren't successful, but I don't think that changes the fact that they did it. They stood up and they tried. And it's not just, surprising and remarkable, it's admirable, for reasons which I will explain as we continue. Because basically, the Puritans, as I say, did not regard women positively. For them, the woman's place was in the home. Having women coming and marching on Parliament and telling them, remember the government at this stage, Parliament is essentially a Puritan Parliament during the Civil War and after the Civil War. The Puritans are being confronted by women, and the Puritans have a very strict attitude towards women. It's not like standing up today. It was much more risky, much more dangerous. Remember, apart from anything else, people could just randomly turn around at any time and say, she's a witch. Okay, and that was one of the things that was going on in those days. And once they'd said that, the chances that you were going to survive got pretty small. Okay, so they were taking that kind of risk upon themselves. They were saying, yeah, we don't care if we die here. Okay, we're standing up because we believe this is right. And there were all kinds of nasty punishments for women. Apart from being a witch, there were all kinds of other things going on. Another interesting thing that's happening is that you've got some of these Protestant sects. I mean, I'm saying that the Puritans essentially were not good news for women, but not all of these sects were the same. That's the whole point. You've got, whereas Catholicism is, in a sense, a single thing, with the Pope at the top, and there is variety. Catholicism, as it's practiced here in Japan, is actually different from Catholicism as it's practiced in England, which again is somewhat different from the way it's practiced in Ireland or Italy or New Caledonia or wherever. It does adapt itself somewhat to different cultures, but you don't get radically different forms of Catholicism in the way that you get radically different Protestant groups. And one of the groups in particular that was growing up at that time was the Quakers. And they were extraordinary, again, in the early days of Quakerism. They stood up and made some very, very radical statements about women and developed some very radical ideas about women. You remember that the Protestants tend to use the Bible as their authority, but one of the problems with the Bible is that you can understand it very often however you want to. And the Quakers certainly did that. The Bible says, let your women keep silence in the churches. Well, you think that's clear enough, and you think that the Puritans would have a field day, and they did. Okay, and they loved it. Women have to shut up in the church. It says so in the Bible. Yay. They love that kind of thing. All right? What did the Quakers do? They said, when it says women, it doesn't actually mean woman by, it means, they mean the flesh as opposed to the spirit. They totally redefined, I don't even know how they managed to interpret it in that way, but they totally redefined what was meant by something that in the Bible seems to be very clear, that says women have to shut up in the church. They said, no, the flesh has to shut up. Whether it's a man or a woman speaking, if the Spirit speaks, the Spirit can speak. So they claim to be following the Bible, but at the same time they interpreted it in a radical, unique way. But it was a way that was very positive for women, in the sense that they were saying, sons and daughters, if you are speaking with the Spirit, then speak up in our church. If you are speaking just with the flesh, then shut up. Men or women. So you got things happening like this. Women standing up in Quaker meeting. The Quaker meeting was very simple. There was no altar, no formalities. Just any room or any space could work for them. And they would just stand like this, and whoever felt moved by the Spirit could speak. And this is still the way Quakers operate today. People who are Quakers tell them, I've never been to a Quaker service, but very often they go and everybody just sits there in silence for an hour or so. Other times they go and somebody feels moved to speak. If you feel moved to speak, whoever you are, male or female, young or old, you should speak. That's what it's for. If you're moved to speak. If you feel the Spirit is moving you to speak, you should speak. Don't speak out of ego. Don't speak from the flesh, but speak from the Spirit. So here's a woman speaking from the Spirit. And one commentator who criticized the Quakers went to a Quaker meeting, and a Quaker woman spoke to him like this. Thou art the woman. So here's the woman saying it to the man, you're the woman. Right? Gender bending in all sorts of ways in the 17th century was going on in an extraordinary way. But here you've got a woman telling the man that he is the woman, because he is speaking from the flesh. So gender and biological sex are being separated, perhaps for the first time ever, really. Okay? Here in the 17th century. I mean, I often, I feel I'm in agreement with those people who say that we're still catching up with the 17th century. Okay? I think almost every idea that we have today about gender issues or all kinds of things, they were talking about it back in the 17th century. It was a time of incredible creativity and exploration of different ideas and possibilities, and here's one of them. Okay? You're the one who has to shut up because you're speaking from the flesh, so you are the woman here. And I can speak because I'm speaking from the Spirit, but you don't, so you have to hold your babble in, right? Shut your mouth. Okay? Imagine in this patriarchal society, a woman telling a man that he is the woman and he has to shut up. Do you think there'd be consequences? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. This is not just something that they could say and then sort of smile and laugh about it and go home and, have supper with their husbands. They were likely to be dragged off and severely punished for saying things like this. So this radical separation of gender from biological sex is going to be so shocking to the people of the time, the mainstream people of the time. The Quaker women who came out with such things were likely to be whipped or put in prison, and they would be told sweeping the house and washing the dishes is the first point of law for a woman. I mean, that's a quotation from a judge sentencing a Quaker woman in a situation like this. You should be at home sweeping the house and washing the dishes. That's what you should be doing. Okay? And the judge would have believed that. Okay? And many members of the society would also believe that. And they would think that it was quite right that women should be punished for speaking out in that kind of way. Punished, for example, like this. They'd have what was called a scold's bridle put on. It's a kind of metal cage with a bit, like a horse has a bit in its mouth, to force it to, go in one direction or the other. They would put a bit in the person's mouth, okay? If you imagine it as something like that. I put this thing over their head, this would be in their mouth. The person behind would, you see how this person is sort of dragging them with a string. That would be attached to the bit at the back. You go this way, you go that way. You do what you're told. Okay. So a very kind of clear message of you are to be controlled by a man. Okay, and it would look something like that. That's an example. And there were different types, but that's one example of a skull's bridle. So something that's put on a horse to control it was adapted and used as a way of punishing women. Now, we saw that the Restoration brought in the winds of change to a certain extent. We had this fun-loving king, Charles II, and somebody actually asked after that lesson, why didn't the conditions for women improve at that time? And my answer was, well, to a certain extent they did. So we start to see a few changes. We get, in 1666, we get Margaret Cavendish being made a member of the Royal Society, which is a society of scientists. Mary Cavendish is made a member of that society, admitting a woman to membership of the Royal Society. Radical, radical. And she's publishing books on experimental philosophy. She's meeting up and discussing things together with the famous names. I mean, again, I didn't learn Margaret Cavendish when I was at university. They taught me about Hobbes, they taught me about Descartes, they taught me about Robert Boyle. These are the famous names. But Cavendish should be up there. All right? We need to reevaluating our history and our understanding of the role that women played, because they were starting to, despite all of the difficulties and obstacles faced in their way, they were starting to take their place among the educated and scientific elite. So she's a striking example of a woman succeeding in a man's world. And she was, of course, severely criticized for it by some people. Again, it's something that's happening at a certain social level. Okay? So many things happen more at a higher social level and then sort of slowly filter downwards. Look at things like international marriage. Okay? Kings and queens have been doing it for thousands of years. Okay? After all, if you're a king, who are you going to marry? A princess. Where does a princess come from? Another country. Okay? It's not rocket science. It's obvious that international marriage has been a part of royalty and the very high class for much longer than it's been normal or accepted among the average population. So this would be another example of women taking a step forwards in the elite, while ordinary women are still, well, then things aren't changing all that much for them. We've got these, this is where I start repeating one or two things. I'm sorry, I meant to cut this out. We've got charity schools like Maynard School. We've got Basua Makin and, okay, I talked about all of that before, so I'm not going to, I'll just move on, all right? But these things were happening, okay, starting, but again, it would be, most of these, so you've got a charity school, but it's only 40 students. It's not going to change the whole society. And you've got these schools, but they are for the elite, those people whose parents can and want to pay for their daughters to get that kind of education. So again, it's not going to change the whole society very much. But it's something, it's better than nothing. The main aim of most girls' schools continued to be the preparation of young ladies of fashion, moulded to the taste of wealthy gentlemen, to whom they were destined to be the future brides. That's That's the bottom line. Even among the elite, that's what most of them are getting for their education. Working class women are lower class women. Excuse me. If they get anything at all, it's just going to be a basic ability to read and write. Okay, so no frills. But even if you're among the elite of women, you're not going to get anything beyond a sort of education in etiquette. So I said that Hackney was the place where boarding schools for girls were growing up. That one or two were set up in other places like Tottenham and eventually Chelsea, which is still one of the sort of fashionable centres of London, Chelsea. It's where people go to do their smart shopping and everything. That was the place that was, in the end, chosen as the site, the favoured site for girls' boarding schools in the late 17th century. And it was to Chelsea that a woman called Mary Astle, who was from Newcastle, went to live in 1688. And Mary Astle is a key figure, I think, for the early study of feminism and what we would call proto-feminism. And her social circle included a lot of noted women from the time. So we can see from Mary Astle and her circle, again, it's mostly an elite thing. It's mostly people who, are in a higher social class. We can see, though, that there were quite a few women who were involved with various kinds of intellectual and social activities at this time. We've got Mary Chudley, we've got Judith Drake, we've got Elizabeth Thomas, we've got Elizabeth Elstob, Lady Mary Wortley, who introduced smallpox vaccination. It's, I think, possibly one of the first examples of a woman making a positive contribution to the field of medicine, okay? As well as being a poet and letter writer. We've got pioneer of Anglo-Saxon studies here. We've got an openly and clearly feminist text, Defense of the Female Sex, being written as a sort of treatise by a woman on feminist issues. Okay, Mary Chudley, poet, scientist, philosopher. Elizabeth Thomas, again, self-educated, taught herself Latin. This circle of women that developed around Mary Astle is, I think, an example of a little kind of spearhead movement that, disappointingly, doesn't seem to move forward very far through much of the 18th century. It's only in the later part of the 18th century that you start to get that kind of really picked up on. And that's when you get Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley, the beginnings of, in most feminist histories will begin their proto-feminism, 100 years after these people. But it's, again, and that's what I keep saying, that the 17th century, all of these ideas were there much earlier than people very often think. So I think it's something to look at, and it's underexplored. People have not gone deeply enough into the role of women in the 17th century, and I think there's still a lot that's coming out. For example, if all men are born free, why are all women born slaves? Okay, openly written, published, and set out in a 17th century text by a woman. Okay? How can that not be proto-feminism? Okay? Those are the kinds of things that I think we really I think we're still catching up in that sense with the 17th century. All right, I'm concluding here, although I think there are quite a few other things that I could have said about this today, and I'll probably spend a few minutes after the presentation talking about some of those things. The word feminism doesn't occur in English until the middle of the 19th century. And we've got a lot of studies of feminism that take Mary Wollstonecraft's a vindication of the rights of women as being the first feminist treatise. But I think we can look back earlier than that, to these women standing up in the time of the Civil War, in Cromwell's time, to that movement of popular protest, to women like Mary Astle and those in her circle. And even looking back into the 16th century, I think we can find some examples of proto-feminism. So basically, Wollstonecraft's basic point was that the advancement of women cannot be achieved without education. And I think that was the first kind of feminist principle, that women deserve an equal education with men. And that point is precisely the point that's been made by women in the 17th century, Mary Astle in particular, and yes, there would be some kind of danger for Mary Wollstonecraft. She lived an extraordinary life, and if you want to study her, she's a fascinating figure. She was writing at the time of the French Revolution. One of her French kind of counterparts was put to death in France during the Revolution. So there were dangers, particularly for feminists in France who were disappointed by the French Revolution. But the bravery of women standing up at the time of the Civil War, when they could be put to death as witches, when they could be tied to the back of a cart and whipped from one town to the next, these kinds of things happen. I think that's something that we should pay tribute to, and we should know about. Okay? The reason that you're here today is because women like that stood up and risked their lives. So I think it's an important thing. And it's an important thing, but it's something that is too often kind of ignored or downplayed, so that we don't hear about women like Astle or Chudley or Drake, and we don't hear about how 17th century women were challenging traditional gender roles and demanding equal treatment for women. We're not hearing it in the same way that we hear it. By the time we get to the late 18th century, that's usually taken as the starting point for all of this kind of thing. And again, I didn't really know that these schools for girls existed in the 16th and 17th centuries until I started doing some digging on the subject. My stereotyped understanding of the subject, which I had inherited from my university education, was that no, women didn't get that kind of education, didn't get anything really. And yet, when you start digging, you find that they were getting something. Maybe not adequate, maybe not enough of it, but it was there. The charity schools, dame schools and girls' boarding schools, again, I knew pretty much nothing about those. I had assumed that they had mostly started up in the 18th and 19th centuries, but they were around in the 17th century. They were making their presence felt. So the real issue then is not so much that women were not getting any education at all, it's more about the kind of education they were getting. Especially those who were rich enough to afford, a paid education at boarding school, and the problem being that the main education that most of them would get would be etiquette and how to get a rich husband. So their education was limited to acquiring social graces, not developing their intellect and studying intellectual disciplines in the way that men did. So that's about it for that topic. And I've, just given you some useful further reading. If you take a look at the private education from the 16th century and developments from the 16th to early 19th century, that's actually pretty good in including education for girls on that website, on that web page. Very, very good, very informative web page. And English Women's Voices, 1540 to 1700, is probably the classic text that you should be looking at if you want to know more about early modern women, by Charlotte Otten. Okay, so if you want to follow this up and find out more about it, those would be my 2 recommended starting points. And that really is it.